Hello, welcome. Nice to have you all here. Before we get started, I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Samantha. I'm a visitor services lead here at Eastern State. I've worked here for about 8 years, so I actually am really excited to talk about this because I was here when we interpreted the cell this way and through all the work, and so I'm really excited to hear what Liz has to say. I'm here today with Liz, our Senior Director of Operations and Preservation, and just really quickly before we get started, just going to talk really quick about Al Capone's time when he was here. Al Capone was here in 1929. He was in Atlantic City, kind of here for a meeting of some mob leaders. He swings by Philadelphia to catch a film in between his two trains. He's going to take a train from Philly to Chicago. When he leaves the cinema, he is arrested for having an unlicensed firearm. Him and his bodyguard, Frank Klein, are both arrested. Within 24 hours, they are tried and convicted and given a year sentence, which is a long sentence at that time for a concealed carry. He starts serving his sentence at Holmesburg, and then shortly afterward is transferred to Eastern State, where he served 7 months. So I'm really excited to talk about Al Capone's cell with Liz. We have it interpreted down in between cell blocks 8 and 9 in an area called Park Avenue. So let's just get kind of right into it. Before we get started on kind of the meat of what we're talking about, can you just tell us first what you do here at Eastern State?
Thanks, Sam. So my name's Liz Trumbull. Like Sam said, I'm the Senior Director of Preservation and Operations here at Eastern State. And so what that means is that it's my job to take care of this 11-acre property. My background is in structural engineering. I have a master's degree in historic preservation, and so I kind of use that overlap to help steward the care of this property. Any contractor that comes through the door, I interact with architects, engineers. With the support of our amazing facilities team, we kind of take care of daily maintenance and then also engage in some long-range planning to make sure that this building that's been here for 200 years can last another 200 years, so that we can continue having these important conversations about the history of this building, what we're learning about our criminal justice system today from what happened here. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I do, and I'm also excited to talk about this project in Al Capone's cell because that was one of the very first projects I worked on when I started at Eastern State back in 2018.
That's awesome. I forgot that you started in 2018. Yeah. So let's first talk about what the initial plans for Al Capone's cell was. Why did Eastern State decide to reinterpret the space?
So as you guys have probably noticed as you were walking around today, we preserve Eastern State as a stabilized ruin. So what that means is that in general, we don't restore this property back to a certain time period. We're going to talk about the nuances of that as our conversation evolves today. But on the whole, when you're walking around the building, you see peeling paint, you see plaster falling off the walls. In this room we're in, this used to be a completely plastered room, but now we're looking at exposed masonry, exposed structural elements overhead, right? When our staff is making spaces accessible to the public, we focus on making sure that they are safe and that as much of the original historic fabric can remain. We try to keep it stable and in place. But if the plaster is too far gone, it's delaminated, it's falling off, we will just remove it and we'll try to stabilize what's left. And so that's where this kind of stabilized ruin notion comes from, is keeping as much of the historic material as possible, but not putting a bunch of new stuff back. So that's our general approach to the site. But as we're looking at this slide right here, this is a picture of what the cell that we interpreted as Al Capone's looked like when I first started in 2018. So I just mentioned peeling paint, falling plaster. You can see that on the walls of this cell. And yet we have all of these pieces of furniture in the cell that are consistent with a newspaper article that described Al Capone's cell at Eastern State in 1929. So we had these like furnishings of the time, but walls that his cell never would have looked like this while he was incarcerated here. And so that was kind of the notion for the project, was to make sure that the finishes matched the furniture, so that it was a complete picture of what it would have looked like while he was here, rather than a little bit half and half and asking people to imagine what it might have looked like. So that was the impetus behind the project, was just to remove the plaster and put a new layer of plaster back up, paint it appropriate to the time period. And that was going to be in and out the project that we had set out to do. And again, this is like a rare example of a project where we were going to pursue restoration as opposed to the stabilized ruin approach. And that was because we felt like it had educational value to do a restoration. We have thousands of cells, so restoring one, wasn't completely changing the character of the property as a whole. So yeah, that's what we set out to do.
Yeah, so that's not exactly what happened, right? I remember actually it was when we were told about it, it was like Al Capone cell is going to be closed just for a few weeks. And so can you tell us what happened? Why did you change course, and how did this study come about?
Sure. So yeah, like Sam mentioned, everyone was Al Capone cell is a popular exhibit here, and so it's kind of a big deal that we were going to close it to pursue this project. The schedule was 3 to 4 weeks in and out, but the way the cell is constructed is it has the standard 2-foot thick masonry wall, so that's just solid stone. And then in most cells, there is plaster applied directly to the surface of the stone, and that was the case in this cell as well. But what made this cell unusual is that on top of that layer of plaster, there had been a grid of nails installed, kind of like 10 to 12 inches on center, and then there was a wire lath hung from that grid of nails, and then plaster applied to that wire lath. And so this is kind of a unique cell to be constructed that way, and because of the time that this property was abandoned from 1971 until the late 80s, early 90s, there was a lot of water damage from that period. The roofs weren't maintained, and that's where a lot of the damage throughout the property comes from, is that those 20 plus years of abandonment. So as you guys might know, right, when steel gets wet, it rusts, it corrodes, it expands, and that expansion of the steel causes the plaster around it to fail. And that was exactly what we're seeing in this cell. You can kind of see some of the darker brown colors in the plaster. That's the rust staining coming through. You can see that the paint is really deteriorated because so much of the plaster had failed. And so the first step in replastering the cell was actually to remove that top layer of plaster that had the wire mesh in it. And that's because it was just so corroded it wasn't able to be salvaged. There was no preserving of that material to pursue our goal of replastering the cell. It had to come off. And so that was always going to be the first step of the project, and this is what that process looked like. They found a place to start working, and then they used a little multi-tool to shear off the nails at the face of the wall. And then here you can see one of our conservators, they developed a technique to kind of gently pry the plaster away from the surface. So it's actually just a piece of plexi that's kind of flexible but also kind of rigid, a thin piece of plexi. So they're kind of shoving that in and kind of using it as a lever to peel the plaster away. And as soon as they started doing this, part of the reason they had to use such a gentle technique is because they started peeling away this top layer of plaster, and they're like, there's so much paint history under here. And we had never seen what was under this top layer of plaster. So we had no idea that there could be anything interesting underneath. We're always approaching projects here with the anticipation that we might find something unexpected, but this was quite unexpected. The paint history on the surface of the plaster that we could see was very minimal. It was just green and white paint, which is very common after 1958 around here. But in the image on the right up here, you can kind of get a sense for how many layers of colorful paint we're starting to see on that surface. And so they kind of slowly kept working their way through the cell. Here's kind of a series of progress images, kind of going from the top left across and then the bottom. So you can see the plaster kind of slowly receding to expose all of the painted surfaces below. And as soon as they started removing everything, we're like, okay, wait a minute, what's going on here? What's the history of all of this paint? Is this worthy of study? Is this typical? And it kind of caused us to put a pause on the replastering project that we had set out to do. And we ended up taking a 4-week project and turning it into a 4-month project because we just completely stopped construction and we went into the archives. We decided we had to understand what the meaning of all of this paint was and put it in the larger context of the history of this place. We had to look at other cells on the property and determine if this was unique or if this is really common. We hadn't really studied one cell in this level of detail before. So yeah, that was kind of when we decided to take a pause.
Just like kind of piggybacking off that, where you said you hadn't studied a cell like this. Did you ever have plans on studying a space like this in this in-depth way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that this property, for as much as we know about it, there is so much that we don't know. And for as much as our nonprofit has grown and expanded the amount of the site that's open to the public and available for people to visit, there still is a lot of triage work that's being done throughout the property from a preservation perspective. We now have covered most of the roofs throughout the property or with a proper modern roof, or at least mothballed them and put some plastic covering on. But I bring that up because it's an indication of how much major stabilization work still remains before we start spending our resources on some of these more detailed or nuanced projects. And so this one was one that had a cause because it's a big visitor attraction and we wanted to better this exhibit. But we happened across this thing that necessitated study. And I feel like there are some areas of the site that we just don't know well enough yet to understand. There could be other Easter eggs like this that we don't know that they exist yet. So to answer your question, we hadn't studied one cell in this level of detail in this way before because we didn't know that this type of thing existed and merited that study. Yeah.
So yeah, can you tell us about the study, about the paint campaigns, and how were you able to determine when each one was in place? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure. So this study was definitely a dual effort. So our conservators were from Materials Conservation, which is now known as Heritage Conservation. And when we uncovered all of this paint history, I kind of went into the archives and the conservators went into the lab. And so what they did was take paint samples from throughout the cell. Okay, this is another before and after image. But here's some close-ups of some of the areas with paint, and I have another one that'll show some of the paint samples. So what they did was take paint samples from throughout the cell, and what paint samples are is just basically chipping off a little piece of the surface and then putting it under a microscope, and it's called a stratigraphy, right? The way that paint is applied to a wall is that it's applied sequentially, right? You don't remove the last layer of paint when you repaint a cell. And so having all of those layers, when you take a paint sample and look at it under the microscope, you can see them, and it's a chronology. So they took them at key locations throughout the cell that would help us to paint a full picture of how it had evolved over time. And so I have some images we can go through in a minute of how we kind of uncovered what that meant. But what I was doing was going into the archive, and my big goal was to figure out, is this cell unique? What is the history of painting and artistry at Eastern State? We had a couple of big examples. I don't know if anyone has been into the Catholic chaplain's office while you've been here today, but that is a beautiful room with 23 murals painted by Lester Smith, who was incarcerated here in the 1950s. And he was actually commissioned by the warden at the time to paint all of those murals. And so that's a great example of art painted on walls of Eastern State by someone that was incarcerated here, but it was in an administrative space and not a personal space. And so this being a cell, that was why we decided to be like, what were people allowed to do this? Was it happening kind of in the background? Was it sanctioned? And I found evidence of people painting in their cells dating back to the very start of this institution in the 1940s. And it seems like the way that people were able to personalize their cells with paint, it happened throughout the history, but kind of if it was sanctioned or not, evolved over time. So we know that people were doing it, but we don't know if the wardens were necessarily allowing it or not. But we know that around the time that Capone was incarcerated at Eastern State, there kind of was a little bit of a movement towards art being a tool for rehabilitation. And so in the 1930s, there was a prisoner named Claude D'Aris who had studied, I believe it was at PAFA, and then was incarcerated here. And he had a cellmate, John Curry, who was 15, but had like a lot of artistic promise. And so Claude was training John Curry while they were incarcerated together, and it like attracted this attention from artists outside of the institution and was like seen as a compelling like argument in his parole. So we know that that was happening, but it wasn't necessarily on the walls of the cell. And then we know that in like moments just before that, people were like thrifting art supplies from different projects that were happening around the penitentiary and using them on the walls of their cell. By the 1950s, there are like sanctioned and institution offered art classes that are being taught out on the basketball court. So we like dug into all of this history to try to understand like, is this common, is this not? But pairing that archival research with the physical evidence was kind of really what opened this up and helped us understand like this is a really unique cell, because not only did it have like the rich paint history spans from 1877 of its construction to the presence of a mural, which we can talk about, to a like paneled interior, and then like coming forth to the like standard green and paint campaigns that we still see a lot of today.
Yeah, let's talk about the mural. Yeah, can you just tell us about it, and how were you able to determine that it was in that cell?
Sure. Let's see what picture I have coming up next. So here's like some examples of areas where we took paint samples from the walls. And then here is some of the stratigraphy. So I'll pause here while I talk a little bit about the mural. Well, maybe actually, let me see if I can find just that picture. Okay, so these are some of the images of the art history that I just mentioned. Okay, but this is one of the pictures that caught my eye when I was going through the archives and trying to understand the history of artistry at Eastern State. So there was a newspaper article published in 1935 that had two images side by side in the newspaper article. And the caption of the photos was had a quote from Warden Smith at the time talking about how the ability of people to paint in their cells was a rehabilitative mechanism that he was in support of, which is interesting coming from kind of the upper level of the institution. This is a little bit of an aside, but I have the newspaper clipping of the two murals or images of the murals side by side with that caption, but I cannot actually find the article that is associated with it. We went to a couple different archives and looked at the microfilm for, I believe it was the Evening Bulletin that it was supposedly published in, but it must have been a different edition of the bulletin that isn't in the microfilm, because I found the newspaper article from that date and it's not in there. So we don't have the article that this image is published in, which I'd love to find someday, because I feel like that would really tell us a lot more about what's happening in here. But anyway, so we only have 3 pictures of murals that were painted on walls at Eastern State. So this is one. This is another one. This is the same image that was published in the newspaper article alongside the other one. And then we also have this image, which dates to much earlier. The other two were 1935. This one is 1903. And this is one of the examples of someone that like was using materials that they had kind of thrifted from around the property to do this. So we have, thousands of cells. We have 3 images of murals. And we've only studied one cell in detail. And one day, our conservator, Andrew Fearon, comes up to me, and he's like, Liz, like, that mural was in this cell. And when I say that mural, I mean this one of the painting of a woman in a landscape. And I just look at him, and I'm like, Andrew, like, you better have some good evidence, because 3 images, thousands of cells, like, what are the chances that this mural happened to be in this cell? And then he gives me his, conservator, like, scientific definitions, and then I built my own case in my mind as to how that was possible. So I'll kind of walk you guys through that a little bit. So let me go back to these slides here. Okay, so we'll talk about the stratigraphy in a minute. But let's talk first about why the mural was in this cell. So this is a picture of the cell as we see it today, and if you guys are still with us around 12:45, we'll try to walk back there together. But in the top left corner of the rear wall is this little stripe of brown paint. And that's like one of the most like intact shapes that we can see in the cell. And so we were really intrigued by that. And we were also just visually looking at the picture of this mural, looking at the rear wall. We're like, it kind of seems like it might match up. So then we took an orthorectified image of the rear wall, which basically just means we took a high quality image of the rear wall and made sure it was like square and like kind of a scale drawing in a way. And then we superimposed the image of the mural on top of it. And so that's kind of what's going on here. And so you can see there's a couple areas, and this was made by our conservator at Materials Conservation. But you can kind of see the areas where there was matching evidence. So that brown stripe is one of them. And some of this is hard to see in the picture, but evident when you're looking like an inch away from the wall in the cell. So another piece in the top right corner. There was a little bit of evidence that kind of border at the mid-height of the wall was still there. And then you can see in the picture on the left, there was kind of a dado or a line running that was probably from a previous campaign that was kind of bleeding through the surface of the paint. There was still evidence of that on the wall today. And then Andrew did find just a little bit of like green from like a landscape in the middle of the wall as well. So those were the things that to him meant this mural was in this cell. But I had to kind of craft a bigger argument based on the site as a whole. And so this is what convinced me. Okay, so the mural we think dated to about the 1930s, and that's because of the paint stratigraphy, which we'll talk about. But in the 1930s, the building that we call the Bertillon wasn't there yet. That was constructed in 1944. And so when we're looking at this map, there's kind of a triangle structure towards the front between the two. Oh, I have a little thing. Okay, so this little building here wasn't there yet, and you can see that it's missing here. So when people came to Eastern State, either to visit their loved ones or a little bit as a tourist attraction in a way, they would walk through this front gate, and then this door right here was kind of a main entrance to the cell blocks. And so that was how people entered, and as soon as they got through that door, they would see the cell that we've been talking about. The cell that we've been talking about is on the, quote, like wrong side of the head gates. The head gates are installed in all of the cell blocks for security. But in that hub between cell blocks 8 and 9, there are 4 cells that are not locked behind the head gates. So it's one of the first cells that you see when you walk in. It's on the wrong side of the head gates, which means that it's kind of like it's special in more than one way. But because it's the first cell that people see when they come in, the like administration probably wanted to make sure that it looked nice and that they were presenting a good like face about what this institution was all about. But it was also probably the most photographed because it was right there. And so when I kind of added that on top of the physical evidence, I was like, okay, it's not crazy that thousands of cells, 3 pictures, 1 study, that one of those murals happened in this cell. So that kind of locked it in for me, that it's likely. Yeah.
That's just that's crazy. I mean, I think about it. I don't think I really realized it was just 3. You just had 3 images of murals, and that just blows my mind. That, like, of all the things, the one cell that we do this work in. Are there any other discoveries that you want to share with this audience that you during that initial study or later on in that cell?
Yeah, that might be a good reason to look at some of the stratigraphy together, because the mural is definitely the most compelling campaign. It just like is such an interesting story of artistry. But we learned a lot about the evolution of this one cell from its construction in 1877 until when this like lath and plaster layer was added, probably in the 1950s. So here we're looking at a couple different paint samples from throughout the cell, kind of layered on top of each other. And you can see, first of all, just like how paint technology changes over time. So at the bottom of this image, we're looking at the wall all the way down here. And then you can see the first like couple layers of paint, they're really thin, right? And then as we start getting into more modern paint applications, every layer gets a little bit bigger. And that's just because of how paint manufacturing and technology has changed. But so when we look at this, we're always interested to see like, okay, well, what was the design intent in 1977 when this was constructed? So that's when you look at the layers that were closest to the wall. And that's where we saw a lot of this like red, yellow, blue. And it's really thin layers that are like seemingly colored with like pigments or dyes. And this is 1880. And we're gonna go through the paint stratigraphy, but then I also have like renderings from each so we can kind of see it in multiple places. But seeing the red, yellow, blue, when I imagine this place in the 1800s and we see all of these black and white images, I don't know about you, but I assumed that it was like white or gray, or like I'd assume that it was just a neutral color palette throughout the property. And then we do stuff like this, and it injects color into an era where we only have black and white images. So we did this study, and I'm like, the cell was blue? Like, that just is not what I would have expected. So that was really cool. And then we get into 1935, this era with the mural. We've got lots of colors associated with that. After that, we see a really interesting campaign of like rust colors, orangey, red, burgundy type colors. But what's interesting about that is not just the stratigraphy, but the placement. And so when we start to look at that throughout the cell, you get this sense that there was a like trompe l'oeil, or like kind of faking of the eye, a paneling scheme throughout the cell, kind of like painting onto the walls what a like wood paneled dining room might have looked like at the time. So just like a really creative expression of like how to bring something like, I don't know, a different vibe to the interior of a cell. And then by 1950, we've just got lots and lots of white. And then by 1960, we're into this kind of more modern campaign of whites and greens. In 1958, one of the wardens issued a memo throughout the property that said the only colors to be used henceforth are green and white. And that was like the official memo in 1958, but probably was like becoming a common practice for a couple years before then, which is why we start to see in the 1950s just like kind of maintenance campaigns of just like a lot of the same colors. So let's like fast forward and we can see what that looks like as a rendering. So again, this is a picture of the cell as we uncovered it, right? It used to have the other layer of plaster. This is with all of that plaster removed. This is what we think it would have looked like when that cell block was constructed in the 1880s. So red on the bottom, blue at the top. Again, like totally different than I would have imagined from that time period. Here's a rendering, a colorized image of that mural. This is a guess based on the physical evidence by our conservator. And then that's that trompe-l'oeil paneling scheme that I mentioned. And then after that, we get to kind of all white, and then what we tend to see today in 1960 with the green at the bottom and white on the top. And then back to today.
Not just that, like, when you think about, because you see images in black and white, also prisons today are usually, you can't decorate your cell beyond maybe a couple of photos, and all the cells are neutral colors. So I think that also probably, colors our interpretation of what we think prison is like in general. And so to see this type of color is just fascinating to me personally. So I'm gonna kind of swing a little before I'm gonna open up to questions from the audience soon, but I just wanted to ask real quick about going back to what the original plan was for that cell. So can you tell us about the current interpretation of Al Capone's cell? And can you also tell us why you ultimately decided to make the move from the cell that we had originally interpreted as Al Capone's cell to the one we have now?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So like I mentioned, there were 4 cells located on the wrong side of the head gates in that corridor between cell blocks 8 and 9. Today, only 2 of them remain. 2 of the cells were combined and became a barber shop historically. But through oral histories, sorry, this is a little winding. I guess I'm trying to explain why Al Capone's cell, as we interpret it, was in that location in the first place. And that's because oral histories suggest that Al Capone was in kind of a more trusted area of the penitentiary called Park Row. And oral histories indicated that Park Row might have been in that corridor between cell blocks 8 and 9 because you had these 4 cells that were on the wrong side of the head gates. We only have 2 of those 4 cells left today, and so our team made the decision to interpret Al Capone's cell in one of those 2 cells back in 2000 when the exhibit went in. So we don't know for sure that that was the cell that Capone would have been housed in, but we made that educated guess back in 2000. And then through the course of this study, if we learned anything definitively, it's that Capone was not incarcerated in that cell, which is kind of ironic. But Capone's time at Eastern State was very well documented. We have lots of detailed articles that describe what his cell would have looked like at that time. And it describes the furniture in great detail. Like if there was a mural on the rear wall of his cell, these articles would have said it. And like Sam said earlier, Capone was incarcerated here between 1929 and 1930, and based on the paint evidence, we think that that mural would have existed at that same time period. So if anything, we learned Capone was not incarcerated in that cell. But while we're deep in these archives, researching all of the paint history, we also, I pieced together that there are these 2 articles that describe Capone's cell here, and they are published a day apart from each other. And the way that our collection and research base for the site has changed over time, we installed that exhibit in 2000 based on 1 article because that was what we had access to at the time. And then at some point in the years following, the second article came to be either on newspapers.com, someone scanned it. We didn't have this article in 2000, but we had it more recently. And no one had put it together that these 2 articles were published 1 day apart from each other and say completely different things. And so the first article is published and describes his cell in great detail. It talks about how Capone had a luxurious cell at Eastern State and talks about the Victrola radio and all these fancy pieces of furniture. And then the next day, there's another article published, this time with quotes from the warden. And the warden is kind of stomping his foot, saying no, he's receiving the same treatment as everyone else here. He has a cellmate. And he's trying to walk back what this article the day before said about Capone getting special treatment. So they're published a day apart from each other. The warden is saying he had a cellmate. So going back to this study, right? We determined Capone was not incarcerated in this cell. We only have 1 other cell in this Park Row. We know now that Capone had a cellmate, even though we were originally only interpreting his cell as having 1 bed. So when we were going through this study, uncovering all of these paint layers, we decided we couldn't plaster it back over. This merited more study. It has its own story to tell. We decided to leave this cell as it was. We decided to move the Capone exhibit into the cell next door and do our original scope of work, replastering the cell, painting the cell, in the cell next door, reinstall the furniture, this time with 2 beds instead of 1. And that's what we did. The cell next door did not have this really detailed paint history. We also thoroughly documented it, but it was just the 1 layer of plaster on the stone. So we were able to kind of just proceed over there. So now when you visit the site, you can come and see the Capone cell on the left, and then our paint study in this cell on the right.
That's awesome. I just wanted to open up the floor to anybody in the audience who might have any questions before we step over to the cell to check it out. All right, I'll ask one more question then. What are your future plans for studying the cell?
That's a great question that I'm not sure I have a great answer for. First of all, like the best preservation practice would be to install some sort of climate control in this space, which we haven't had the capacity for in the past. It's also just complicated to do 1 cell and not everything else around it. But I think that is still something that's worth exploring to kind of prolong the lifespan of the paint finishes. And I am still interested in putting this cell into a bigger context and doing more studies of cells that have a paint history throughout the rest of the property. So when we were kind of on pause in this project, my boss Sally and we did a like informal survey of cells throughout the rest of the site, kind of trying to identify if there were other ones that merited more study. And we found a couple that had kind of a similar paneling thing going on. We found a lot of faux wood graining on cells, which was always interesting to see. There's a lot of graffiti, but some of it is really artistic on the walls. We didn't have the capacity to dig into every one of those and do this level of study, but I would love to do that survey with a little bit more intention and structure behind it and say these 10 cells are worth digging into a little bit, and try to understand if there's other stories at play that can help us better understand this one.